Well, Shabbat Shalom, and welcome back to the 31st part of our study of the book of Revelation. As you can see, we're back in our old room again, those of you who are joining us online, as the colder weather has made our main living room unlivable in. So here we are as we conclude the first of the 3 sets of 7 judgments, 7 seals. Let's just have a quick resume of what we talked about last week, especially for those who were unable to come or had to go off to do various tasks. Well, last week we discovered that there were 2 groups of rescued or saved people who, because of their faith, purity, and sacrifice, were deemed worthy of the first resurrection and of direct access to the throne room where the Father, Son, the 7 Ruachot, or the 7 spirits, the 24 elders, and the 4 seraphim, or Zoar, or living creatures, all live. And the 144,000, you'll remember, are granted access because of their purity and consecrated service, whereas a great multitude of others are welcomed because they endured terrible suffering and martyrdom, refusing to deny their Elohim and Messiah. Now that's not to say, of course, that the 144,000, 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, aren't also sent out to suffer and in some cases perish for the Messiah. These 2 groups of saints are one people, redeemed people, after the glory of the Son. The 144,000 being called to be the rulers with Messiah in the millennium. Moreover, they're not necessarily only those of the last generation, but in view, they represent the faithful saints from all generations, and we have yet to learn more about them, and indeed all the other inhabitants of the throne room too, but we shall do that later on in this course, and indeed today we're going to discover some other residents of the throne room. So let's get straight into our text today. If you want to follow, we're using the New King James Version as usual. Revelation chapter 8 and the first 6 verses. When he opened the 7th seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. And I saw the 7 Malachim, or angels, who stand before Elohim, and to them were given 7 shofars, or trumpets. Then another angel, having a golden censer, came and stood at the altar, and he was given much incense, that he should offer it with the prayers of all the saints upon the golden altar, which was before the throne. The smoke of the incense, with the prayers of the saints, ascended before Elohim from the Malach's hand. And then the Malach, or the angel, took the censer, filled it with fire from the altar, and threw it to the earth. And there were noises, thunderings, lightnings, and an earthquake. So the 7 Malachim, or angels, who had the 7 trumpets, or the shofars, prepared themselves to sound. Now the other day, one of you was telling me your experiences in Hurricane Katrina, when it struck your hometown. And correct me if I get this wrong, because my memory isn't always the best from conversations, but you were taking refuge in a Baptist church as your parents' home had no storm cellar, and you recall that just before the storm struck, there was an eerie silence. Not a sound from nature could be heard. Not what? Pardon? But that was from the tornado, I beg your pardon. All right, it's the tornado then we're talking about here. No birds, no wind, nothing. And up in the north of Norway, beyond the tree line in the Arctic Circle, I believe one of you told me about a place where there is complete silence to be found. Was it you who's been there? Someone I know from Norway has visited up in the Arctic Circle by the coast, and apparently there's not a sound, because there are no trees up there, there are no birds or animals up there, absolute dead quiet. And though there are, of course, times even here in the Swedish countryside where we also experience complete silence, apparently it isn't nearly as silent as either of these. And in the case of Katrina, all animal life must have sensed the hurricane was on the way and either left or gone into hiding. And of course, everyone here has experienced a summer storm. We had 1 or 2 this summer, 1 or 2 quite violent ones. And do you remember just before the storm burst on us, there was complete silence, the wind dropped, no animals could be heard. It's the same thing. And for those of us who live in hurricane zones, this is a sign to dash for cover and to literally bolt down your hatches. It is Yahweh's way, in an act of grace, of forewarning humans to take cover, and if needs be, to hopefully repent as well. And then the hurricane broke loose, and you said that you looked incredulous, or the tornado, I should say, you looked incredulously as it ripped out tree after tree by the roots as though they were weeds being skillfully and effortlessly plucked out of the soil by an experienced gardener. And I think you said there were metal sheets, weren't there, flying around the place as well, from roofs. And I'm sure there were lots of other things flying in the air as well. And I'm sure you've all seen videos of tornadoes and so forth, and you know that all kinds of stuff gets thrown into the air, including cows, amongst other things. Now, I doubt that the half hour of silence in this passage is something like that, but I believe there is more. I don't suppose many of you are classical music enthusiasts, as I am, but one thing I used to most love and still do are live concerts. I never feel a piece of music is complete without being somehow part of a large audience sharing in the experience. When I was young, I used to record concerts from BBC Radio 3, and I always made it a point to record not only the symphony or the concerto, or whatever the piece was, but I also liked listening to the explanatory introduction because I like to know a bit of the background of the piece of music and the composer. But I like listening to the sounds of people muttering and conversing quietly before the concerto started. It gave a sort of a human touch to it, to know that there were other people there as well. And then, of course, you would participate in the applause as the conductor and the orchestra leader and any soloists came onto the stage. So I can still truthfully say that I enjoyed listening as much to the music itself as I did participating in that atmosphere or the phronema of the concert hall. There is something special about it. And I only ever, could you ask whoever's next door to not make so much noise? Thank you. I only ever once attended a concert live with a friend, and that was in London. Of course, it's pretty expensive going to concerts, even back in those days in the 70s and the 80s. But it was nice. It was special that my friend was there. His two parents were there with us. We were sort of a little group, or a little family, as it were, in the midst of this huge concert hall in London. I think it was the London Festival Hall, if I remember rightly. And we heard some classical music. The first time I ever went to such an assembly. And yes, I can enjoy listening alone to a pre-recorded piece of music, but it's not nearly the same as being with the audience as well as the orchestra and participating in the whole thing. I don't know if you understand what I mean by that. Maybe you've been to other kinds of concerts where just having the people there with you makes it all the more special. The thing is, that is how we're supposed to experience the Bible as well. And so I was delighted when years ago, the wife of a family friend who had recently passed away gave me an entire reel-to-reel tape collection of concert recordings from Radio 3 back in the 1970s. I've got them right at the back of my office here. And I still listen to them. And I'm sure you sometimes wonder why I sometimes cry out a bravo or something like that, or encore, after I've listened to a symphony which is particularly moving. It's because I'm going with the spirit, if you like, of the audience there. Now, I only mention this because sometimes, very rarely, a piece of music can be so profoundly moving that it can stun an awestruck audience into complete silence. And back in those days of the 70s, Bernard Levine, one of the greatest London journalists of the generation before mine and writer for the Times newspaper, was also a concert goer and a music critic. And he, like myself, had as two of his heroes Schubert and Mozart. So he was no stranger to thunderous applause and standing ovation, the celebration of a delighted audience after a majestic performance. But on one occasion, at the end of a recital of Schubert's songs by one of the finest singers of the day, he described how the audience simply sat stunned in silence, and then, still in silence, got up slowly and left the concert hall. It was almost as though they were having a spiritual experience, and they were just awestruck. The spell of the music had been so powerful that nobody dared to break it with anything so mundane as clapping. Never experienced that myself, but it must have been special. Now, I would like to suggest to you that part of the half-hour silence that John reported when the seventh seal was opened, something like this. Such moments as the one reported by Levine, and which others of us have similarly experienced, are very rare and precious. They remind us in our noise-soaked world that silence can be not simply the absence of noise, in which one can sense aspects of reality which are normally drowned out by chatter and babble. And remember, excuse me, got a frog in the throat today. The perspective is that of the throne room. So this half an hour silence is being witnessed by John in the throne room with all the other beings there. So that is the scenario. And I would like to suggest that the perspective of the wicked is one of fear about what is going to erupt. And they know it's not going to be good for them. But the perspective of the righteous is more akin to that awed classical concert audience. And when the Lamb opened that seventh seal, there was silence in heaven lasting about half an hour. A sense of awe, expectation, and anticipation is present. The otherwise ceaseless praise of the four seraphim, the Zohar or living creatures, dies away. So you've got all this praise that's been going on continuously, and suddenly, not a peep, not a sound. The otherwise ceaseless praise has turned into total silence. The song of the 24 elders, the Malachim or the angels, 144,000, and the huge countless crowd falls quiet. Everyone seems to be holding their breath. This is the moment, it seems, that they've been waiting for thousands of years. And we, the readers, watch, hardly daring to breathe ourselves. Or we will when this event actually comes to pass one day in the near future. Now I know there are some musicians in here, at least three that I can count. And you will all obviously be able to tell me, and everyone else here, that pauses or silences between the notes and chords are every bit as important as the notes and the chords themselves. You can imagine what it would be like if all the notes were blurred together and there was no sound between them. It would be an unholy noise. And as every comedian and actor will tell you, timing is of the essence. Every orator knows that carefully spaced periods of silence between sections of speech not only bring clarity, like punctuation marks in a piece of text, but they also serve to build up tension, to build up anticipation, and to sharply focus the mind. Have you ever been listening to a very lively speech and suddenly the speaker stops? The quiet is almost deafening, isn't it? As he then picks up his thread again and begins to speak in his normal way. And handling silence is an art. And it doesn't even have to involve speech or music. Just take Russian President Vladimir Putin, who is not a good orator. He's rather boring sort of person to listen to, actually. Quite a drab speaker, but he's nevertheless quite brilliant in what he doesn't say. And to such good effect that he leaves his enemies guessing what he's going to do next as part of his success, I think. What I want to convey to you today is the concept that silence is a kind of speech as well. It contains information, though you would not suppose it to be so. And Yahweh is himself the master of silence. How many times have you gone to Yahweh and prayed and say, why don't you speak to me? Without going into the reasons why you might not be able to hear him. But there are times he doesn't say anything. Everything is quiet from the spiritual perspective. And he doesn't answer our every question, because silence from him is sometimes better for us. There are things to be learned. in the silence. He doesn't inform us of everything we want to know or what we think we ought to know. And as we've already mentioned, Yahshua, the son of Elohim, accepts the silence of Yahweh's response to the question as to when he's coming back, whether it be asked by ourselves or by him, because neither he nor we know when he's coming back. And Yahweh has the absolute right to be silent. Now, this is not, of course, or not remotely a passive-aggressive response in which silence is weaponized by those who may have issues of one sort or another, but it is rather it's something positive, like the silent pauses between musical notes, giving the sound its form and life. With no silence, our ears would quite simply be overwhelmed. And as we all know, frustratingly, life can sometimes be about long waits. We can and must and do get on with other things while we wait, whatever it is that we're waiting for. But sometimes we must do nothing. Have you ever participated in a minute's silence? Maybe in remembrance of someone or of an important event. We used to do it on Poppy Day in Britain to commemorate the dead of the 2 world wars. I think it was 3 minutes though, back then. But up until now, there has been dread, absolute dread, at the opening of each of the first 6 seals. But the 7th is not preceded by immediate action. First the 4 horsemen, then the souls under the altar, then the terror seizing earth's inhabitants. Then remember there was a pause, as Yahweh's faithful are sealed, so that the great damage that was bound to be done upon earth when Elohim's judgment came sweeping through would not harm them. And in that pause we were privileged to glimpse, for the encouragement of those undergoing persecution, a vision of the heavenly reality in which, instead of a little bedraggled group of people beaten up by a vicious mob or judicially tortured and killed by an oppressive regime, Yahweh's people appear as this huge crowd, celebrating Yahweh's victory and their own deliverance, like the concert goers celebrating a magnificently played piece of chamber music, with Yahweh himself looking after them and protecting them. I did a lot of meditating about this particular verse, in fact just a few words, and I found it surprisingly informative and very revealing. I would like to suggest to you that sometimes, not always, sometimes, silence is the greatest worship and praise that we can give. I call this Sabbath worship, not Sabbath day worship, when we join in song and expressions of gratitude in an assembly like this one, but Sabbath worship in the sense of restful worship. We need no noise to generate that kind of worship because it flows directly from the spirit of the created, that's us, to the Ruach, or the spirit of the Creator, bypassing the physical altogether, the equivalent of groaning inwardly when we cannot find words to express ourselves adequately, as Romans 8 verse 23 mentions. And I suspect this is what Pentecostals and Charismatics are attempting to do by babbling nonsense in an aroused emotional state and falsely calling it tongues or unknown heavenly tongues, and believing it is some kind of higher communion. The only private prayer language we have with Elohim, with God, is inward communion accompanied by physical silence. And I'm sure we all do lots of silent praying. So someone reading the book of Revelation for the first time and reading about the first 6 seals would be forgiven for supposing something even more spectacular than the great display of praise and worship around the throne was about to happen. And disappointing though this great hush might appear to be, in reality it is telling us that something huge, something powerful, something utterly decisive, a spiritual hurricane or tornado, is now going to happen. Indeed, interestingly, we see that the next cycle of 7 is introduced even before the earthquake comes, making for sufficient overlap to convince us that this is indeed a sequence of 3 interconnected cycles, and not the same cycle being repeated in another way. After the 7 seals, we then have the 7 trumpets, or the shofarim. Okay, so we are now introduced to 7 angels or Malachim who stand before Yahweh, revealing, not unsurprisingly, that there are other inhabitants of the throne room, or at least beings who have access to it, in addition to the 24 elders, the 4 seraphim, the 144,000, and the great multitude. And these 7 are traditionally known as the Malachim, or the angels of the presence, and have a well-documented history in Israelite literature. And again, if I can remind you that 7 is the number of completion and perfection throughout the Tanakh, or the Old Testament. Yahweh Elohim ended the work of creation on the 7th day, and this is why the day of rest, or the Shabbat, which by the way translates literally to rest, that's why it's a divinely appointed rest day. It's the 7th day of the week. And you also remember that the Shemitah, or the remission year, just like the current one, because we haven't been growing anything this year, is when the land rests and is the 7th year, and the Yovel, or the Jubilee year, in which both the land and possession of it rest, coming after 7 cycles of Shemitah. 7-fold vengeance was to be taken on anyone who might kill Cain in Genesis 4:15, and Noah took 7 of each clean animal on board the ark. And from Pharaoh's dream of the 7 fat and the 7 lean cows, Joseph predicted 7 years of abundance and 7 of famine. And of course the number appears over and over again in connection with sacrifices and temple ritual. The Moedim, or the appointments of Pesach and Sukkot, Passover and Tabernacles, on which 7 lambs were offered, each last 7 days. And 2 times 7 weeks intervene between Yom HaBikurim and Shavuot. If Israel is unrepentant, we're told, she will be punished 7-fold for her sins. Jericho fell after Israel had marched around the city 7 times, and after 7 priests had blown 7 shofars. Hannah, celebrating her fertility at the birth of Samuel, prayed, she who was barren has borne 7 children. Solomon took 7 years to build the temple. The Shunammite woman's child sneezed 7 times before opening his eyes, where Elisha raised him from the dead. And in the latter days, 7 women will take hold of 1 man. Now, I could make an entire series of sermons just on the number 7 alone, because it's such an important number. I just want you to be aware of what kind of things the number 7 is attached to in the scriptures. It is also a number of fullness and completion throughout the book of Revelation. It speaks of Elohim's perfection and the finality of his coming and of his judgment on mankind. And as we read in chapters 2 and 3, John writes about 7 messianic communities or churches. The 7 spirits, the 7 ruachot, the 7 gold menorahs, the 7 stars, 7 flaming torches, 7 seals, a lamb with 7 horns and 7 eyes, 7 malachim with 7 trumpets or shofarim. And we are yet to meet the 7 thunders, a dragon with 7 crowns on its 7 heads, which are also 7 hills and 7 kings, and 7 angels with the last 7 plagues in 7 great bowls, and moreover he pronounces 7 blessings. So 7 and 7th actually appear 60 times in the book of Revelation, because this is a completing work. This is a completing text. If you want to know how it all ends, and all the different parts of that ending, it is represented by 7, because it is the completion or the ending of the particular era or eon. And though there were almost certainly more than 7 congregations in Asia Minor, those names with their specific issues and spiritual strengths represent more. So, as should be obvious, there being 7 malachim or angels is very significant. So an interesting question is, do we actually know who they are specifically? Does anyone know any of the names of those 7 angels? You do know at least one. One of these angels, by the way, of the presence is mentioned in Isaiah 63:9, and one is named in Luke 1:19. There's your clue. That's the name of the angel mentioned in Luke 1:19, who tells Joseph, I stand in the presence of Elohim. A friend of ours says that name, Gabriel, that's right. And Ezekiel tells us in the 9th chapter that I heard him call out in a loud voice, bring the guards of the city here, each with a weapon in his hand. And I saw 6 men coming from the direction of the upper gate, which faces north, each with a deadly weapon in his hand. With them was a man clothed in linen, who had a writing kit at his side. They came in and stood beside the bronze altar. Now, I mentioned that because an altar is mentioned in the text, but just hold that for a moment. And if we turn to the apocryphal book of Tobit, I don't suppose many of you have read that. It's in Catholic Bibles. It's in some Protestant Bibles today. Raphael identifies himself as one of the 7 Malachim, or the Kodesh Malachim, or the holy angels. And as you go to the Pseudepigrapha, we find in 1st Enoch, you'll find all 7 angels are named together with their functions. They're called watchers. Their names are Uriel, Raphael, Raguel, Michael, Sarakel, Gabriel, and Remiel. And then as you dip into the Talmudic traditions, we find the first 4 described as Malachi Hasharet, or ministering angels, with other Jewish writings linking them to 4 non-woe shofar judgments. However, we must tread very, very carefully because, we do not regard any of these books as scripture because they are extra-biblical sources. But we at least know what was believed back then, and some of these names may be accurate. Who can say? Which brings us now to the trumpets, or more accurately, the shofars, or the shofarim. And it's unfortunate that our English Bibles speak here of trumpets because, when you think of a trumpet, you think of, like the trumpet you play, a brass instrument from a brass band. And the Bible does talk about metallic trumpets, but they are always silver. Remember the 12 silver trumpets that are blown at Rosh Chodesh, or the new moon, and also at Yom Teruah, or the day of trumpets. But these particular trumpets aren't them, nor must we confuse them with those because they have a very different symbolic meaning. The idea that the great or final judgment of the last days, the last of the last days, is heralded by blasts on the shofar has its roots firmly in the Old Testament, like this particular passage I'm going to read to you from Zechariah chapter 9. Then Yahweh will be seen over them, and his arrow will go forth like lightning. Yahweh Elohim will blow the shofar, and go with the whirlwinds from the south. Yahweh Sabaoth, or the Lord of hosts, will defend them. Yahweh their Elohim will save them in that day, as the flock of his people, for they shall be like the jewels of a crown, lifted like a banner over his land. And in a similar passage, Yahweh protects Israel in chapter 7 of the book of Revelation, in the first 8 verses, before setting the shofar judgments in motion on that day, about half an hour afterwards. And I'll leave you with some other references to check up if you want to research that in a little bit more detail. And while we're still on the subject of that short silence in heaven, a couple of teaser questions. Number 1, why not exactly half an hour? Why only about half an hour? Was this just John sort of making a personal estimate? Or does the vagueness of the duration have a purpose? The second teaser question is this a literal half hour or is it symbolic? And if it's literal, is it half hour in the throne room or is it half an hour on the earth? Because there's a huge difference. Now, I'm going to give you my personal opinion here. You can agree or disagree, of course. But my answer to the first question is that the vagueness is deliberate so that no one can calculate the exact day of Yahshua's return, which I figure you probably would be able to if you knew that this was literally 30 minutes. But that only because I believe this to be literal and symbolic at the same time. And it's literal because that's the approximate amount of time before a physical storm breaks loose, and symbolic because I believe this is a prophetic timepiece. Now, if with Yahweh is a day like 1,000 years and 1,000 years like a day, as Peter says, then we're being told here that this approximately half-hour intermission will last about 20 to 21 Earth years. In other words, between the 6th and the 7th seals being opened and the 7 Malachim being released, there will be a breathing space of peace. Enough time to seal or prepare the remnant for the next 2 cycles of horror leading to Armageddon. And whereas the first 6 seals are a wake-up call to the remnant, to get their house in order, the seventh seal, the seven trumpet judgments and the seven bowl judgments can only be released when Yahweh's own people are properly sanctified and living the way they should be. That is to say, living the millennial kingdom lifestyle, all of it. For how can they be Yahweh's appointed rulers? How can they be Israel's priests? How can they be Israel's kings if they aren't living the divine way themselves? And you need some experience and time to do that if you're going to represent yourself as an authority on the way that Yahweh wants his people to live. Because rulership in the kingdom is first and foremost by example and not by diktat. And this means, if my interpretation is correct here, that the period of the 6 seals is the time when the final gathering to the 12 places of refuge must be taking place, because the remnant, coming as it will from every conceivable cultural background and Christian or Messianic tradition, must be forged into a single tradition and way where they are of one doctrinal mind. Goodness knows we've tried to do it and we have failed. In short, they will need time to become echad or one. And if I'm right about the symbolic aspect of the half-hour-long period of silence, this is going to take a good couple of decades. That makes sense to me. That makes sense to me. And my mission is preparing, as it were, all the bricks and mortar and the phronema for all of that through my teachings and website, just as David prepared all the materials and the wealth needed to build a temple in his day. So those of you joining us now, and there are people who are sort of identify with us but haven't formally joined us, that's quite a few at the moment, in order to be a part of that material assembling project that you want to be, this is an important point. That's what we're here about right now. And I mentioned this to you because the 4th of November last year was a prophetic marker for our particular half hour. And you may have come across a very short little article on the website for that day. So let's get back to the main body of the text. The 7 angels have been given their shofars, and then another angel, another malach, appears, and his job description is that he accompanies the prayers of all Elohim's people, and not only those of the martyrs described in chapter 6, verses 9 and 10. So you've got the prayers of both the martyrs and the 144,000 rising together, not all at once, but separately. And when all have finished, the malach, or the angel responsible, collects them and presents them as a single united prayer before the throne of grace. Now, I don't know if any of you have read the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs. It's a pseudepigraphic work in which there's one book for each of the 12 tribes. But the Testament of Levi put it this way, interestingly. In the heaven next to the highest heaven are the angels of the presence of Yahweh, who minister and make propitiation to Yahweh for all the sins of ignorance of the righteous. And they offer to Yahweh a sweet-smelling savour, a reasonable and bloodless offering. And if you'd noticed in the text that we read today, how many altars are there? How many altars are in those first verses of chapter 8 that I read to you? Really? One. There's only one altar there. But how many altars were there in the temple in Jerusalem? When we had our great dedication, we spent days and days talking about all the parts of the instruments of the temple. How many altars were there in Yahweh's temple in the Old Covenant? 2. There were 2 altars. One for burnt offerings and another for incense. But since there can be no animal sacrifices in heaven, of course they've all been done away with, and heaven is in any case a spiritual realm, there is only the altar for incense. And the reason why is explained clearly to us by the writer of Hebrews, and this is a beautiful summary of the relationship between Christ and the New Covenant, and the Old Covenant rather. Hebrews chapter 9, if you want to follow, I'm going to read a fairly sizable piece of text here. This is why even the first covenant was not put into effect without blood. When Moses had proclaimed every commandment of the Torah to all the people, he took the blood of calves together with water, scarlet wool, and branches of hyssop, and sprinkled the scroll on all the people. He said, "This is the blood of the covenant which Elohim has commanded you to keep." In fact, Torah requires that nearly everything be cleansed with blood, and without the shedding of blood there is no forgiveness. It was necessary then, said the writer of Hebrews, for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these sacrifices, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Messiah did not enter a man-made sanctuary that was only a copy of the true one. He entered heaven itself, now to appear for us in Elohim's presence. Nor did he enter heaven to offer himself again and again, the way the high priest enters the most holy place every year, as at Yom Kippurim, with blood that is not his own. Then Messiah would have had to suffer many times since the creation of the world. But now he has appeared once for all at the end of the ages to do away with sin by the sacrifice of himself. Just as man is destined to die once, and after that to face judgment, so Messiah was sacrificed once to take away the sins of many people. And he will appear a second time, not to bear sin, but to bring salvation to those who are waiting for him. The Torah is only a shadow of the good things that are coming, not the realities themselves. And for this reason, it can never, by the same sacrifices repeated endlessly year after year, make perfect those who draw near to worship. If it could, would they not have stopped being offered? For the worshippers would have been cleansed once for all and would no longer have felt guilty for their sins. But those sacrifices are an annual reminder of sins, because it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. Therefore, when Messiah comes to the world, he said, "Sacrifice and offering you, that is Yahweh, did not desire, but a body you prepared for me. With burnt offerings and sin offerings you were not pleased." Then I said, "Here I am. It is written about me in the scroll, I have come to do your will, O Elohim." First he said, "Sacrifices and offerings, burnt offerings and sin offerings, you did not desire, nor were you pleased with them, although the Torah required them to be made." And then he said, "Here I am. I have come to do your will." He sets aside the first covenant, that's the old covenant, to establish the second, or the new one. And by that will we have been made Kodesh, or holy, through the great sacrifice of the body of Yahshua the Messiah, once for all. Day after day, every priest stands and performs his religious duties. Again and again he offers the same sacrifices, which can never take away sins. But when this priest had offered for all time one sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of Elohim. And since that time he waits for his enemies to be made his footstool, because by one sacrifice he, Christ, has made perfect forever those who are being made holy. The Ruach HaKodesh also testifies to us about this. First, Yahweh says, "This is the covenant I will make with them after that time," says Yahweh. "I'll put my laws in their hearts, and I will write them on their minds." And then he adds, "Their sins and lawlessness, or Torahless acts, I will remember no more." And when these have been forgiven, there is no longer any sacrifice for sin. Therefore, brothers and sisters, we have confidence to enter the most holy place by the blood of Yahshua, by a new and living way opened for us through the curtain, or the veil. That is his body. And since we have a great priest over the house of Elohim, let us draw near to Elohim with a sincere heart, in full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled to cleanse us from a guilty conscience, and having our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds. Let us not give up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, but let us encourage one another, and all the more as you see the day of Yahweh, or the day of judgment, and the second coming approaching. So, we've already heard in Revelation 5 verse 8, the prayers of Yahweh's people on earth are presented before Elohim like incense, so that the sense of smell in the heavenly throne room is just as delightful and satisfied as those of sight and sound. And here the Malach, or the angel, approaches once more. And this time he's given a large quantity of incense. The incense and the prayers, it seems, are not exactly the same thing. The prayers are perhaps like the charcoal on which the incense will burn. But one way or another, the prayers of Yahweh's people, not least the prayers of the martyrs who lie under the altar, are coming before Elohim's throne. But there may yet be another dimension to the silence of the first verse that's worth considering. Some believe that the praises of heaven must pause for a while so that the prayers of earth may be given a proper hearing. And the main point, however, is that the 7 shofars and what they bring will be part at least of Yahweh's answer to the prayers of his people for vindication. The sequence of divine judgments, necessary, as I've said before, for evil to be conquered and Yahweh's glorious new resurrection world to emerge, is not a mechanical plan which will grind on forever, irrespective of human agency. And Yahweh, as we have seen, is committed to working in the world through human beings. Prayer, even the anguished prayer of those who do not understand what is going on, is a vital element in this mysterious cooperation, which Paul articulates so beautifully in Romans chapter 8, verses 26 and 27. In the same way, he says, the Ruach helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Ruach intercedes for us with groans that words cannot express. And he who searches our hearts knows the mind of the Ruach, because the Ruach intercedes for the saints in accordance with Elohim's will. So, if prayer from earth down here is presented by means of a golden censer, you know what a golden censer looks like, the immediate answer is given in the same way. The angel, having offered the incense, now fills the censer with fire from the altar and throws it onto the earth. The result is a global earthquake. Until evil has been judged, condemned, and radically uprooted from the earth, the only word that earth as a whole can hear from heaven is that of judgment. So the thunder, the rumblings, the lightning, and the earthquake in today's text come at the close of each section of the book, picking up from their initial appearance in front of Yahweh's throne. And here they appear at the close of the 7 seals, at Revelation 11:19, after the 7 shofars have sounded, and at Revelation 6:8, once the 7 bowls of wrath have been poured out. Nothing can prevent heaven and earth finally coming together, as we shall read in the opening verse of the final chapter of Revelation. But before the resurrection world can come to be, and before we can live in it, inhabit it in peace, first must come all the events that we are starting to unpack. And if you think for any length of time on them, the descriptions in Revelation are really quite mind-boggling. Nobody wants the judgments, but we understand that if this horrible cycle of oppression and death is to come to an end, it must be done so fairly, according to Yahweh's own justice. And it's hard to believe that all that's described here is going to happen. But once you've realized that our Heavenly Father is in earnest, then it is time for proper fear and trembling to set in. Only the foolish and arrogant think they can escape the judgments by scaling the heights to heaven, as the builders of the Tower of Babel tried in Genesis 11. Yahweh remains sovereign, and as long as earth remains the haunt of evil, his answer to it must be fire. And you remember Yahshua himself, the gentle lamb of his first coming, declared in Luke chapter 12 that he had come to do what? He had come to throw fire upon the earth. Those are his own words. And we as his servants are obliged to inform the world, pleading with it to repent and to embrace the Saviour. And so here in today's passage, the angel with the golden censer continues the lamb's strange, perhaps to some of us, strange work. So I apologize for this very condensed presentation today. I've had a really terrible week, so I pretty much did everything, all my preparation yesterday and the day before. Next week we're going to move on to the second cycle of judgments, consisting of plagues from which the remnant, that is the 144,000, are protected, because they have been marked, and they will have been marked because they have fully left behind the perverse cultures of the world system and embrace the fullness of Messianic Israel that's so beautifully described in Isaiah chapter 4. And while false Christendom more and more gives Yahweh the pretext to remove all the protective Torah fences, we must be in the business of putting them back up, as Isaiah chapter 5 verse 5 tells us. For until that's been done, the body will continue to needlessly suffer. Yahweh looked for justice and found it denied, for righteousness but heard the cries of distress. We read in Isaiah 5:7, when it need not be so. So come to Yahweh's vineyard and find peace and security, because for everyone else outside there will be none, at least for the duration of all of these terrible events. So I look forward to seeing you next week. May Yahweh bless you all. Amen.